On Christmas Eve, my own daughter pressed her hand over my plate and said I wasn't allowed to eat because I hadn't contributed. In that moment, surrounded by silence and eyes that looked away, I realized the person I had loved and sacrificed everything for had turned me into an unwelcome burden. My name is Virginia Whitcomb, and that night, something inside me broke for good. The house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, the kind of scent that used to mean comfort and belonging. That night, I had done what I could to make it feel like home again. I hung the garland across the banister, arranged the red napkins on the table, and spent hours peeling potatoes until my hands ached. I stirred the butter into the mashed potatoes just right, the way David always loved them, hoping that somewhere in the familiar flavors, I could find a trace of the warmth I'd lost since he passed. By the time the candles flickered on the table, I thought perhaps we'd managed to create something close to the Christmases I remembered. The lights on the tree glowed softly, casting a golden hue across the faces I longed to feel connected to again. For the first time in 3 years, I allowed myself to believe maybe, just maybe, this holiday would not hurt so much. We all sat together, the clinking of glasses and the sound of the children's laughter filling the room. Eleanor carved the turkey with sharp precision. Thomas poured the wine like nothing could disturb his appetite, and the children fidgeted in their seats, waiting for their plates to be filled. I held my plate carefully, the edges warm against my hands, and rose to take my turn. My chest swelled with a fragile hope as I leaned toward the serving platter. Then her hand stopped mine. Firm, deliberate. My daughter's eyes were cold when they met mine, her voice cutting clean through the hum of conversation. She said I hadn't contributed, and that meant I wouldn't eat. The words fell like shards of glass across the table. Silence descended. Even the children stopped whispering. Thomas kept chewing, head bowed, as if nothing had happened. He reached for his glass, swallowed his wine, and did not so much as flinch. The room carried on, but I was frozen there, my plate suspended in my hands, empty and trembling. I waited for someone to speak, for someone to break the spell, to insist that this was wrong. Instead, forks scraped against plates, the sound unbearably loud in my ears. My throat tightened, my chest burned, yet I couldn't force a single word out. It was as if the very air had turned against me, suffocating me in that moment of rejection. I felt the sting most when I saw Emily. Her wide eyes darted between her mother and me, confusion twisting her small face. Slowly, as if she understood what I could not yet process, she slipped a spoon into the bowl of mashed potatoes and offered me a mound of it on her fork. Her gesture was clumsy, innocent, and unbearably tender. Before I could reach for it, Eleanor snatched the fork from her daughter's hand. Her voice snapped like a whip. "Sit down, Emily. She needs to learn her lesson." The shame spread through me like fire. My granddaughter's kindness crushed in an instant, my own child turning my humiliation into a spectacle of discipline. I lowered my gaze to the plate in my hands, still empty, still waiting. The room blurred. The laughter, the warmth, the flicker of candles all twisted into a cruel theater where I alone was the outcast. I set the plate down slowly, carefully, afraid my trembling fingers might drop it. Inside, something fragile snapped. For years, I had swallowed the subtle dismissals, the quiet slights, the feeling of being tolerated rather than cherished. But this was a public decree that I was no longer part of them, that my place at the table was conditional. The food smelled rich and tempting, but it turned bitter in my throat just breathing it in. I could barely hear the chatter resuming around me, as though nothing had occurred, while my insides screamed at the injustice. I lifted my eyes once more to the table, to the family I had longed so deeply to feel whole with, and as the fork scraped against porcelain and the children laughed nervously, I held on to my empty plate and felt the last illusion of belonging disintegrate. That night, in front of those I loved most, I was no longer a mother, no longer a guest, not even a person worthy of a seat. I was nothing but a reminder of what they chose not to value. And though my heart cracked under the weight of it, somewhere beneath the shards of pain, a quiet resolve began to stir. The years I had spent under Eleanor's roof felt like they had drained the marrow from my bones. Every month, I handed her $600 from my pension, almost half of what I lived on. It was meant to be my contribution, a fair share to keep harmony in the household, but the money never softened her gaze. Instead, it became the price of my presence, as though I had to pay rent for the privilege of being tolerated. I rose before the sun each morning to make oatmeal for the children, packed their lunches, and drove them to school in the freezing dark of Pennsylvania winters. I folded their laundry, scrubbed the kitchen floors, and stirred pots of soup that I rarely tasted myself. When I returned in the evenings, I often found the refrigerator bare, the dinner plates already washed and stacked, leaving me with scraps of bread or a lukewarm bowl of broth as if I were an afterthought. It was never enough. Eleanor's voice would echo across the kitchen whenever the utility bills arrived. She would wave the paper at me, her tone sharp and accusing, insisting the electricity was high because I left lights on, or that the water bill spiked because of my long showers. In truth, I barely used either. I lived like a shadow in her home, careful not to take up space, not to consume more than I could justify. Still, in her eyes, I was always the culprit. One night, as I stacked the last of the clean dishes, she leaned against the counter and delivered words that cut deeper than any reprimand. "If you were as good at making money as you were at sewing clothes, you'd keep it for yourself. Don't expect this house to carry you." The remark hung heavy in the air, sharp as glass. I didn't answer her. I simply turned back to the sink, my hands moving in silence while her words lodged themselves inside me like thorns. I realized then that this house, where I had hoped to find comfort, where I thought family might shelter me from loneliness, was nothing more than a gilded cage. My presence wasn't measured by the meals I cooked or the children I cared for, but by the cash I handed over each month. Affection had a price tag, and once I paid it, the ledger of love remained stubbornly blank. The humiliation of that Christmas night hadn't erupted out of nowhere. It had been building for 3 long years, brick by brick, remark by remark, until the walls of cold indifference had shut me out completely. I thought of David often during those years, of how he used to insist that family was about more than bills and bank accounts. But in Eleanor's home, I was not family. I was simply an expense, begrudgingly tolerated as long as I stayed useful. The morning after Christmas, the house was quiet. Eleanor had taken the children shopping, her laughter trailing off as she shut the door. I lingered upstairs, too heavy with shame to face the world outside. That was when I noticed her laptop on the desk, its lid half closed, still humming with power. Something in me hesitated, but suspicion pressed harder. My hands trembled as I typed in Emily's birthday, Eleanor's favorite password. The screen unlocked without resistance, and suddenly, I was staring at a truth I had never wanted to see. I scrolled through her inbox, my breath catching as I found a string of emails exchanged with Thomas. Each line was colder than the one before. They spoke of a plan, laid out with clinical precision, to place me in a nursing home once the holidays ended. It wasn't the kind of place with warm gardens or private rooms. It was a facility on the edge of town, the sort where 4 beds crammed into one room, where dignity withered beneath fluorescent lights. My stomach twisted as I kept reading. In one message, Thomas had written that once I was settled, they could finally breathe again. Eleanor replied that selling my things would help with their debts. Attached was a list: clothes, jewelry, and at the very end, the piano. David's piano. The one we had bought together when we were young and still building a life. I had dusted its keys every week, even though no one played it anymore. It was a relic of love, and now it was nothing more than collateral in their eyes. I wanted to stop, but my eyes dragged me further down the page. That was when I saw it, the line that split me open completely. If she dies in there, we'll finally be free. The screen blurred as tears welled up, my chest caving under the weight of betrayal. Christmas had already broken me, but this was proof it wasn't a careless moment of cruelty. It was a strategy, planned and nurtured behind closed doors, rooted not in anger but in calculation. I wasn't their mother, their helper, their support. I was a burden to be managed, an obstacle to be removed. I shut the laptop with shaking hands, the echo of the click ringing in my ears like a final verdict. For years, I had clung to hope that the coldness I felt was temporary, that one day Eleanor would soften and remember who I was to her. But in that moment, the last of that illusion died. What happened on Christmas Eve wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was the unveiling of a truth they had been hiding all along. And as I sat in that silent room, my heart in shards, a new thought flickered through the grief. They had written their plans in ink, but I had just read them in fire, and fire, I knew, could consume everything. The glow of the computer screen still lingered in my mind long after I shut the laptop. I sat in the dim corner of my room, the silence pressing against me like a weight. Beside me stood the same scuffed leather suitcase I had once carried to long hospital shifts when David was alive. I hadn't touched it in years, but that night, its presence felt like a lifeline. I printed every email, the harsh words spilling across the paper like wounds carved in ink, and tucked them carefully into a manila folder. I placed it inside the suitcase next to the framed photograph of our wedding, David smiling at me as though nothing could ever break us. I pressed my hand against the glass, as if drawing strength from the man who had always seen me as enough. With trembling fingers, I dialed Margaret's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and steady, just as I remembered. I told her only what I could manage, that I needed to leave Eleanor's house, that I had nowhere else to go. She didn't hesitate. "Come, Virginia. My guest room is yours for as long as you need. You'll be safe here." I felt the knot in my chest loosen for the first time in years. The next morning, I walked into the bank with my folder clutched against my chest. The carpet smelled faintly of polish, the air too cold, but my steps were sure. I told the account manager I wanted to revoke Eleanor's joint access to my checking account and end the automatic transfer of $600 a month. He raised his brows, tapping his pen against the form. "Are you certain? This is family we're talking about. These are binding ties." I looked him straight in the eye. Family without respect isn't a tie. It's a shackle. Cut it. My signature flowed across the paper with a steadiness that surprised even me. When it was done, I stepped outside into the winter air, the cold biting at my cheeks. I felt lighter, as though I had been carrying chains I hadn't even realized were there. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table while Eleanor and Thomas argued in the living room. I pulled a sheet of paper toward me and wrote slowly, deliberately, "I'm leaving to reclaim the respect I deserve. Don't look for me. Don't call me. When you learn what respect means, only then think of me again." I folded the letter, placed it in the center of the dining table, and laid my hand over it for a moment. It was both a farewell and a declaration. When I stood, I knew there was no turning back. Snowflakes drifted across the windows as I pulled the suitcase to the door. The house was quiet, lit only by the blinking Christmas lights in the living room. They pulsed in red and green, a cruel reminder of the holiday warmth I would never find here. I paused, listening to the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, then pulled the door shut behind me. The cold slapped against my face as I stepped into the night. Margaret had already arranged for a taxi, its headlights glowing faintly at the curb. I slid into the back seat, clutching the handle of my suitcase. As the car pulled away, I turned once, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror. The lights flickered faintly until they disappeared into darkness. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to return. When we reached Margaret's small home, the smell of cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee greeted me at the door. Her embrace was steady, her smile genuine, and the tension in my shoulders eased. She showed me to the guest room, simple but warm, with a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I lay down and, for the first time in years, fell into sleep without the weight of dread pressing on my chest. Back at Eleanor's, the storm had already begun. In the morning, she discovered my absence. I imagined her rushing to check the account, only to find her access denied. The steady flow of my pension cut off. Panic must have filled that kitchen. The phone on my nightstand buzzed and buzzed, her name flashing across the screen again and again. I let it ring. By the time she found the letter I had left, I was miles away. I pictured her face blanching as she read my words, Thomas's jaw tightening in fury. She dared to defy us, he would snarl, but this time, their anger no longer chained me. I sat by Margaret's window that evening, watching snow fall gently onto the quiet street, the church bells in the distance ringing out the hour. My heart was steady, my chest no longer burning with humiliation. I whispered to myself, almost in disbelief, that Christmas Eve was the last time I let them humiliate me. For the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't empty, it was freedom. A week had passed since I slipped away into the night, but peace never lasts long when someone is determined to drag you back. One gray afternoon, I heard voices outside and stepped onto the balcony of Margaret's home, below. Eleanor stood on the porch, her face blotched red from tears or cold. I couldn't tell which. In her arms, she clutched Emily and Daniel close, using their small bodies like a shield. "Mama," she called up, her voice breaking, "please come home with us. The kids miss you." Emily clung to her mother's coat. Daniel rubbed at his eyes. My heart tugged at the sight of them, but I forced myself to remain steady, leaning on the railing of the second floor. Distance was the only protection I had left. Eleanor kept repeating, "We're family. We belong together," as though the word itself could undo the cruelty of her plans. But family had become a hollow sound to me, stripped of meaning the moment she plotted to discard me in a place where dignity went to die. Emily tilted her head upward, her little voice floating painfully clear. "Mom said you left because you don't love us anymore." The words pierced me sharper than Eleanor's insults ever had. She was poisoning them with lies, twisting innocence into a weapon. I felt the ache rise in my chest, but I refused to let it silence me. "No, sweet girl," I called down gently. "I left not because I stopped loving you, but because your mother stopped respecting me." Eleanor's mouth fell open, her eyes darting away as if she could pull the words back before the children heard them. I held her gaze, unwilling to let her hide. Then I spoke the name of the nursing home I had read in the emails. The color drained from her face instantly. She stammered something about misunderstandings and temporary plans, but her hands tightened on the children's shoulders. Emily and Daniel stood bewildered, sensing the tension but unable to grasp the full betrayal simmering between us. I kept my voice steady, each word deliberate. I know what you and Thomas intended, and there is no going back from that. Eleanor's lips quivered, her protests crumbling in the cold air. I turned away, my heart heavy, but resolute. The children's wide eyes followed me, but I could not step down, not when I knew what awaited me if I did. The very next afternoon, the pounding on the door rattled Margaret's quiet house. Heavy fists slammed against the wood, and a voice bellowed from the street. "Virginia, get down here right now. We're going to settle this like adults." I stepped out onto the balcony once more, Margaret appearing at my side with the phone clutched in her hand, her thumb hovering over the dial. Below, Thomas stood with his fists clenched, his face red with fury, his body coiled like a man ready to fight. "You lived in my house, ate my food, used my water and electricity," he shouted, spit flying with each word. "You owe me. You were nothing but a bill we carried." The neighbors began to peek through curtains, some drifting out onto their steps, drawn by the noise. My pulse quickened, but I forced my voice calm. "I already paid," I answered, each word cutting the air. "With every dollar of my pension I gave you, and with the decades I spent raising Eleanor into the woman she is, don't you dare stand there and tell me I've been a burden." His rage cracked, but he pushed back harder. "That wasn't enough. You think you can just walk away?" I lifted the folder I had brought with me, the one filled with his own words. "I have your emails, your plan to send me to that nursing home, every vile word. Would you like me to read them aloud right here, in front of everyone?" A murmur rippled through the small crowd gathering at the end of the street. Margaret raised her voice, steady and firm. "Police are on their way. Leave now before you add another crime to your list." Thomas faltered, his face flushing deep crimson. His bluster collapsed under the weight of exposure, his body shrinking with each second of silence. Finally, with one last attempt at intimidation, he shouted, "You'll come crawling back. This family needs your money." I leaned forward, my voice sharp as glass. "No, a family needs love. It needs respect. And those are two things you'll never take from me again." He turned on his heel, storming down the street under the watchful eyes of the neighbors, stripped bare of his mask of civility. I remained on the balcony, breath steady, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift, not in their favor, but mine. Months passed quietly after I closed the door on that house, but word traveled faster than I expected. One afternoon, Margaret returned from the market with a story from a neighbor who still lived near Eleanor. The bank had finally moved in. The proud 2-story house, once polished and perfect for holiday postcards, now sat under foreclosure, its locks changed, its windows dark. Eleanor and Thomas hadn't been able to keep up with the payments without my pension filling their cracks. The news spread further. They had held a garage sale, dragging furniture and belongings onto the driveway like scavengers. People came and haggled over their lives, dollar by dollar. I was told the old piano, the one David and I had saved months of wages to buy, was wheeled away on the back of a truck, a relic of love and memory reduced to a transaction for cash, sold to a secondhand store for less than the price of a month's groceries. It twisted my stomach to imagine strangers striking the keys, not knowing the sound once filled our living room with laughter and songs, but I let the ache settle. That piano wasn't what made David's memory alive. What burned inside me stronger was the realization that Eleanor had bartered away not just wood and ivory, but the history she once swore she cherished. Eventually, they had no choice but to move into a cramped apartment across town. Gone were the wide front porch and manicured lawn. Now it was a 2-bedroom walk-up with peeling paint. I heard Eleanor took the sofa while Emily and Daniel shared a bunk bed shoved into the corner. What had once been a display of success had shrunk into the echo of survival. Part of me wanted to ache for them, and perhaps I did. But that ache came mixed with something colder, something almost cleansing. This was the cost of arrogance, the toll of their cruelty. For years, they had demanded I carry the burden. Without me, they had to carry themselves. Neighbors whispered that Thomas had lost his job not long after the house went. He grew bitter, snapping at Eleanor with words laced in venom. He accused her of ruining everything, of being the reason they'd fallen. For the first time, she knew what it was like to stand in the line of fire, to be treated as a problem instead of a partner. When I heard this, I felt a strange stillness settle in me. They were drinking the same poison they had poured down my throat for 3 long years, the same contempt, the same dismissive cruelty. It had circled back to them. And as much as it hurt to know my grandchildren lived in the wreckage of their choices, I could not stop the thought that pressed itself firmly into my mind. They were finally tasting the bitterness they had forced me to swallow. March arrived with the thaw, the snowbanks melting into gray slush along the curbs. I had just finished folding laundry at Margaret's kitchen table when she handed me a white envelope. My name, written in a shaky script I recognized instantly, stared up at me. For a long moment, I only looked at it, my fingers resting on the paper, the pulse in my wrists quickening. Finally, I slid a knife beneath the flap and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting slanted unevenly, as if the hand that wrote it had trembled the entire time. "You were right, Mama," it began. "I treated you like a burden, and now I know what that feels like, because Thomas treats me the same way." I drew in a breath, pressing the paper flat against the table. The words were blunt, not dressed in excuses, and yet I felt the sting of doubt. Was this confession a truth torn from her heart, or another plea wrapped in manipulation? Inside the envelope, another piece of paper slipped free. It was a drawing in bright crayons, Emily's work. My granddaughter had drawn a stick figure grandmother standing apart from the rest of the family, but around me she had drawn a radiant yellow halo, brighter than anything else on the page. Beneath the figure, in uneven letters, she had written, "Grandma shines." My throat tightened. I went back to Eleanor's letter. "I'm not asking for money," she wrote. "I only want a chance to make things right." Those words stopped me. For the first time, there was no demand, no accusation, no twisting of guilt, only an admission. She hadn't written to scold or to beg, but to face what she had done. The paper carried the weight of humility I had never thought I'd see from her. Still, my heart wrestled with itself. I longed for Emily and Daniel. I missed their laughter, their hugs. Yet the memory of Christmas Eve remained raw, the humiliation still etched into my bones. I could not simply erase years of betrayal with a few sentences, no matter how contrite. The evening light slanted through the window, catching on the edges of the page. I thought of Eleanor's new life in that cramped apartment, the arguments with Thomas, the bitterness she now tasted daily. Perhaps she had finally begun to understand what she had inflicted on me. Perhaps pain had become her teacher, as it once had been mine. I folded the letter carefully, slid the drawing back inside, and held the envelope against my chest. My forgiveness was not hers to demand, nor mine to give lightly, but for the first time, I felt the faintest stir of possibility, like a door cracked open, waiting for someone brave enough to walk through with honesty. At the very least, Eleanor had learned one truth: respect cannot be forced, and love cannot be bought. It must be earned. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to start trying. Life with Margaret settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Mornings were filled with the smell of fresh coffee and chatter at the women's club, where I found myself laughing easily with women my age, trading recipes and stories. Afternoons, I taught basic first aid to a group of restless teenagers at the community center, showing them how to wrap a bandage or steady a pulse. In the evenings, I sat at long wooden tables with neighbors, the chessboard between us, relishing the slow, thoughtful battles of the game. For the first time since David died, I felt useful, not because someone depended on my money, but because my presence truly mattered. One evening, I sat at Margaret's desk and wrote back to Eleanor. My words were careful, measured. If you want to rebuild, it must begin with respect. Without that, no apology can hold weight. I did not promise more, nor less, just a door cracked open, waiting. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it beside David's photo. His smile stared back at me, steady as ever. I didn't know if Eleanor would ever truly change, but that uncertainty no longer consumed me. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Revenge had never been about destroying them. It was about reclaiming myself. They had brewed their own downfall. I had finally chosen peace,